Hey guys, tonight we're traveling to the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth, Yakutia, in Russia's Sakha Republic, where the thermometer doesn't just drop below freezing, it plummets to minus 71 degrees Celsius. A temperature so extreme that your breath doesn't just fog, it crystallizes into tiny ice needles that tinkle as they fall to the ground. You're standing outside right now, and within 30 seconds, the moisture in your nostrils has frozen solid. Within 2 minutes, any exposed skin begins the irreversible march toward frostbite. Within 5 minutes, if you're not near fire, not moving, not generating heat, you're probably not going to make it. This isn't adventure tourism or a survival reality show where a camera crew waits nearby with thermal blankets. This is Yakutia in January, and the stakes are as real as the cold is absolute. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'm curious. Drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. Are you in California at midnight? Sydney at lunch? Maybe you're actually in Siberia right now, chuckling at my attempt to describe your daily commute. I'd love to know. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've just arrived in Oymyakon, one of 2 settlements that compete for the title of coldest inhabited place on Earth. The other is Verkhoyansk, about 600 kilometers north, but the rivalry is friendly. When you're both experiencing temperatures that would kill an unprepared human in minutes, quibbling over a degree or 2 feels absurd. The village spreads before you, a collection of wooden houses with smoke rising from metal chimneys, each plume a visible lifeline. The smoke doesn't rise gracefully here. It's so cold that it freezes mid-air, creating strange horizontal clouds that drift like ghostly rivers above the rooftops. Your host, Nikolai, a third-generation Yakut herder, greets you at the door of his home. His face is weathered, creased by decades of squinting against snow glare and wind, but his eyes are bright with the particular humor of someone who survived 100 winters that would terrify most of humanity. "Welcome," he says in accented Russian. "You picked good week to visit. Only minus 67 degrees Celsius today. Very comfortable." He's not joking. In Yakutia, comfort is relative, and anything above minus 70 degrees Celsius genuinely qualifies as mild. Inside, his home is almost oppressively warm, perhaps 20 degrees Celsius, and the contrast makes your skin prickle and burn as circulation returns to your extremities. The heat radiates from a massive cast iron stove in the center of the main room, a beast of a thing that consumes logs as thick as your thigh. Nikolai gestures toward it with the reverence usually reserved for religious icons. "This," he says, "is life. When fire goes out, you have maybe 2-3 hours before house is same temperature as outside. Then you have decisions to make." He's talking about the fundamental calculus of Yakutian survival, a math problem that has defined human existence in this region for thousands of years. What do you burn when the fire goes out? It sounds simple, maybe even morbid, but it's the question that separates the living from the frozen dead in this landscape. Because here's the thing about minus 71 degrees Celsius that you probably haven't considered while cozy in your bed. At these temperatures, nearly everything you think you know about survival stops working. Matches don't light because the phosphorus can't achieve combustion temperature. Metal tools shatter like porcelain when struck. Diesel fuel gels into useless sludge. Even the batteries in your flashlight die within minutes, the chemical reactions inside them grinding to a halt. So when your fire dies, and it will die eventually because you fell asleep or ran out of prepared kindling or simply misjudged how much fuel you'd need to make it through a 3-day blizzard, you're left standing in a wooden house that's rapidly cooling toward lethal temperatures, surrounded by objects, and you have to decide, what burns first? The Yakut people, who have inhabited this region for over 1,000 years, developed an entire cultural knowledge system around this question. They didn't write it down in manuals or survival guides. They encoded it in stories, in the design of their homes, in the strategic placement of every piece of furniture and every stored supply. Historians still argue whether this knowledge system represents conscious engineering or evolutionary selection. Did the Yakut deliberately design their culture around thermal efficiency? Or did the families who happened to make better burning decisions simply survive while others perished? Either way, you're about to inherit this wisdom tonight. because Nikolai has agreed to walk you through the hierarchy of combustion, the careful ranking of every burnable object in a Yakutian household, from the obvious to the desperate to the unthinkable. But first, you need to understand what you're fighting against. Yakutia, officially the Sakha Republic, spans over 3 million square kilometers, making it roughly the size of India, but with a population of less than 1 million people. It sits in the heart of Siberia, where continental climate patterns create what meteorologists call an extreme continental subarctic zone. In summer, temperatures can actually reach 30 degrees Celsius, which means Yakutia holds the distinction of having the greatest temperature variation of any inhabited place on Earth, a swing of over 100 degrees Celsius between seasons. But winter is what defines this place. Winter is when the sun barely clears the horizon, offering only a few hours of weak, slanted light before darkness returns. Winter is when the Sakha language has 17 different words for types of snow and ice, because general terms become useless when precision means survival. Winter is when the ground freezes solid to a depth of 1,500 meters. Yes, you read that correctly, over a kilometer down, creating what geologists call continuous permafrost, ground that hasn't thawed since the last ice age. In this environment, heat isn't just comfort. Heat is metabolism, consciousness, life itself. Your body, right now, is generating roughly 100 watts of heat just to maintain its core temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. That's about the same as a bright incandescent light bulb. In a temperate climate, this is plenty. Your body sheds excess heat through your skin, your breath, your sweat. But at minus 71 degrees Celsius, you're not shedding excess heat. You're hemorrhaging it. The thermal gradient between your core and the surrounding air is so steep that heat races out of your body through every available pathway. Radiation, conduction, convection, evaporation. Your 100 watts of internal heat production might as well be a candle flame in a hurricane. Nikolai pours you tea from a samovar. Another heat source, you notice, another small furnace keeping water perpetually hot, and settles into a chair near the stove. My grandfather, he begins, used to say that Yakut people are not born. We are forged, like metal in fire, yes? The weak ones, they don't make it past first winter. The strong ones, they learn what can burn. It's a grim sentiment, but there's archaeological evidence to support it. Infant mortality rates in pre-Soviet Yakutia were staggering, with some estimates suggesting that fewer than half of all children survived to age 5. The cold was an unforgiving selector, and the knowledge of fire management, passed from parent to child, from elder to youth, was literally the difference between genetic continuity and extinction. So, Nikolai continues, leaning forward, you want to know what burns first? I tell you, it depends. It depends on how much time you have. It depends on how many people you must keep warm. It depends on what season, what supplies you have, whether help is coming. He pauses, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the stove. But most important, it depends on what you can afford to lose. And there it is, the central tension of our entire journey tonight. Survival in Yakutia has always been a negotiation between immediate need and future consequence. Burn your furniture and you have nowhere to sit, nowhere to prepare food, but you live through the night. Burn your door and you have no protection from wind, from wolves, from the next storm, but you live through the night. Burn your children's winter boots and they can't travel come spring, but they live through the night. Every choice is a trade, and the currency is time. Outside you hear a sharp crack like a rifle shot. Nikolai doesn't flinch. Trees, he explains. When temperature drops fast, sap inside freezes, expands. Tree explodes. In deep winter, forest sounds like war zone. It's a detail you wouldn't have imagined, but it makes perfect sense. Water expands when it freezes, and trees are full of moisture. In Yakutia, nature itself is constantly shattering under the pressure of cold. You sip your tea and feel the heat spreading through your chest, your stomach, radiating outward. This simple warmth, this basic comfort that most of humanity takes for granted. Central heating, insulated walls, reliable electricity, is a modern luxury. For thousands of years, warmth in Yakutia meant fire, and fire meant fuel, and fuel meant choices. Tonight, we're going to explore those choices together. We're going to build a mental inventory of everything in a traditional Yakutian household. ranking each item by its caloric content, its burn duration, its replaceability, and its cultural value. We're going to examine the physics of combustion at extreme cold, the chemistry of different materials, and the brutal economics of survival. And yes, we're going to venture into the uncomfortable territory of what people burned when absolutely nothing else remained. But we'll do it slowly, methodically, the way you'd approach any serious bedtime story, with curiosity, with respect for the people who lived these realities, and with the understanding that this isn't morbid fascination. This is human history. This is how our species survived in places where survival should have been impossible. Nikolai stands and opens the stove door, revealing a bed of glowing coals. He adds a single log larch, you'll learn later, chosen specifically for its density and burn time, and closes the door with a satisfied nod. Fire management, he says, is meditation. You must always think 3 hours ahead. What will you need? What will you burn? How long will it last? You settle deeper into your chair, pulling a reindeer fur blanket around your shoulders. Outside, the temperature continues to drop. Inside, the stove ticks and pops, metal expanding and contracting, the sound of combustion and entropy in eternal balance. Let's begin. The human body, your body, is a furnace that cannot be allowed to go out. Right now, as you lie there listening to this, your cells are performing roughly 37 trillion individual chemical reactions per second, most of them dedicated to a single purpose: generating heat. This is metabolism, the fundamental alchemy that separates living tissue from dead matter, and it operates within a vanishingly narrow temperature range. Drop your core temperature from 37 degrees Celsius to 35 degrees Celsius and you enter mild hypothermia, shivering, confusion, impaired judgment. At 32 degrees Celsius, your shivering stops, not because you've warmed up, but because your muscles can no longer coordinate the rhythmic contractions. At 28 degrees Celsius, your heart begins to fibrillate, beating in chaotic, useless patterns. At 24 degrees Celsius, you're almost certainly dead, your proteins denatured, your cellular machinery seized like an engine run without oil. That's a descent of just 13 degrees. 13 degrees between normal and dead. Now consider that in Yakutia, the temperature differential between your core and the surrounding air isn't 13 degrees. It's 108 degrees. Your body is trying to maintain 37 degrees Celsius in an environment of minus 71 degrees Celsius, and the laws of thermodynamics are not on your side. Heat flows from hot to cold, always, irreversibly, and the steeper the gradient, the faster it flows. At minus 71 degrees Celsius, heat doesn't just leave your body. It floods out, cascading through every pathway physics provides. Nikolai is explaining this to you now using a kettle as a prop. He fills it with boiling water and sets it outside the door, on the wooden step. Watch, he says. You both stand in the doorway, you're wearing every layer you brought, plus borrowed furs, and you're still cold, and observe. The water in the kettle begins to steam, thick white clouds boiling up into the darkness. But the steam doesn't rise. It falls, pooling around the kettle like dry ice in a stage show, because the water vapor is instantly freezing, becoming heavier than air, cascading downward in a waterfall of ice crystals. 3 minutes, Nikolai says. Maybe 4, then ice. He's right. Before your eyes, the surface of the water develops a skin, then a sheet, then a thick layer. The kettle, which was boiling just moments ago, is now encased in ice. The speed of it is genuinely shocking, a visceral demonstration of how aggressively this environment strips away heat. And a kettle, unlike you, doesn't have metabolic needs, doesn't require oxygen, doesn't suffer tissue damage from freezing. You, on the other hand, are a catastrophically inefficient heat engine in these conditions. Let's do the math, because numbers make the danger concrete. Your body at rest produces about 100 watts of heat, as mentioned earlier. But at minus 71 degrees Celsius, you're losing heat through multiple mechanisms simultaneously. First, there's radiation. Your body emits infrared energy in all directions, roughly 100 watts under normal conditions, but the colder the environment, the faster you radiate. Then there's convection. Air moving across your skin carries heat away. And in any kind of wind, this becomes the dominant factor. Even a gentle 10 kilometers per hour breeze at minus 71 degrees Celsius creates a wind chill equivalent to minus 90 degrees Celsius or colder. Finally, there's conduction. Direct contact with cold surfaces pulls heat out of you through physical touch. Sit on a metal bench at minus 71 degrees Celsius and you'll experience frostbite through your clothing in under 30 seconds. Add these pathways together and you're losing heat at a rate far exceeding your body's ability to produce it. Within minutes of exposure, your core temperature begins to drop, and the cascade begins. But here's where it gets interesting, where the physics becomes personal. Your body doesn't surrender evenly. Prioritizes. It sacrifices. Nikolai brings you back inside and gestures to his hands, scarred and weathered, 2 fingers on his left hand truncated at the second knuckle. Frostbite 1989, he says matter-of-factly. I was young, stupid. Thought I could fix snowmobile in storm without gloves. 5 minutes, maybe 6. By the time I get back inside, fingers already white, hard like wood. They don't hurt. That's the trick, yes? When it stops hurting, you know you've lost them. This is your body's brutal triage in action. When your core temperature begins to drop, your hypothalamus, the tiny region of your brain that regulates temperature, makes a cold calculation. Save the core, abandon the periphery. Blood vessels in your fingers, toes, nose, and ears constrict, shunting warm blood away from these extremities and concentrating it around your vital organs. It's a survival strategy refined over millions of years of mammalian evolution, and it works. Your heart, lungs, liver, and brain remain warm and functional a little longer. But those abandoned fingers? They freeze. Water inside the cells expands into ice crystals, rupturing cell membranes, destroying tissue. The damage is irreversible, and if you're lucky, you lose just the tissue. If you're unlucky, gangrene sets in, bacteria feast on the dead flesh, and sepsis kills you days later, warm and sheltered, because of decisions your body made in those first desperate minutes of cold exposure. Historians still argue whether indigenous Siberian populations developed physiological adaptations to extreme cold. There's some evidence of modified circulation patterns, higher baseline metabolic rates, different distributions of brown fat, but the consensus is that culture, not biology, made survival possible. The Yakut people didn't evolve antifreeze in their blood. They evolved knowledge, practices, and technologies that kept them within the narrow band of survivable temperatures. And the most critical technology, the one everything else orbits around, is fire. Fire is the external furnace that supplements your failing internal one. A proper wood fire produces anywhere from 3,000 to 8,000 watts of heat, depending on size and fuel type, 30 to 80 times your body's output. In a well-insulated space, a single fire can maintain livable temperatures for a family, offsetting the relentless thermal drain to the outside world. But fire requires fuel, and fuel is always limited. This is where the hierarchy begins to matter. Not all combustible materials are created equal. When you burn something, you're breaking the chemical bonds that hold its molecules together, releasing the energy stored in those bonds as heat and light. Different materials store different amounts of energy, burn at different rates, and produce different amounts of ash and smoke. In chemistry, we measure this as energy density or calorific value, typically expressed in megajoules per kilogram. Here's a quick comparison. Dry wood contains roughly 15 to 20 megajoules per kilogram. Coal, which the Yakut did use when they could trade for it, contains 24 to 30 megajoules per kilogram. Animal fat, which we'll discuss later, can reach 37 megajoules per kilogram, close to diesel fuel. But these numbers only tell part of the story, because burn rate matters as much as total energy. A kilogram of newspaper and a kilogram of oak log contain similar amounts of energy, but the newspaper burns in minutes while the oak smolders for hours. In Yakutia, where leaving the fire unattended overnight is sometimes necessary, burn duration can be more important than total heat output. You need fuel that releases its energy slowly, steadily, creating a stable temperature rather than a brief spike followed by lethal cold. Nikolai is building up the fire now, demonstrating technique. You see? Big log on bottom, that's larch or pine, very dense. Burns slow. Then smaller pieces, birch maybe, burns hotter, faster. Then kindling on top, gets everything started. It's architecture, yes? Each piece has purpose. He's describing what modern fire builders call the upside-down fire method, though in Yakutia it's just called the correct way, because any other method wastes fuel. The fire burns from top to bottom, each layer igniting the one below, creating a controlled cascade of combustion that can last 6, 8, even 10 hours without tending. But even the most efficient fire eventually requires more fuel, and this is where the inventory becomes crucial. In a traditional Yakutian household, and Nikolai's home, despite some modern additions, still follows traditional principles. Every combustible item exists in a mental ledger, ranked by a complex formula of replaceability, necessity, and caloric value. Nobody writes this down, nobody creates a spreadsheet, but everyone knows. Children learn it through observation, through the stories elders tell, through the silent choices made during hard winters. At the top of the hierarchy, the most expendable and abundant, are the designated fuel materials: harvested wood, dry dung, stored kindling. These are gathered specifically to be burned, and using them represents no sacrifice, no difficult choice. A well-prepared household might have several cords of wood stacked outside, though at -71°C, you can't store it too far from the house, because fetching wood in those temperatures is its own life-threatening adventure. Just below the designated fuels are the marginal materials, with scraps from repairs, broken tools, worn-out sleds, damaged containers. These items have outlived their primary purpose but still hold value as secondary fuel. Burning them is pragmatic, not desperate. Then come the functional trade-offs. Items still useful but potentially expendable if the situation demands. This is where the psychology gets complex, where families begin to disagree, where cultural values clash with survival arithmetic. And at the bottom of the hierarchy, we'll get there eventually, I promise, but we have all night and there's no rush, are the unthinkable fuels, the materials that represent such profound loss that burning them means survival has already failed in some fundamental way. Outside, another tree explodes with a sound like breaking glass. You flinch. Nikolai doesn't. You get used to it, he says. In coldest winter, sounds like someone breaking into house every night. My wife, first year we married, she would wake up screaming, thinking we were under attack. Now she sleeps through it. Brain learns what to ignore. It's a small reminder that adaptation isn't just physical. Living in Yakutia requires psychological adjustments, a recalibration of what registers as dangerous versus merely normal. Temperatures that would trigger emergency responses in most of the world are just weather here. Sounds that would provoke panic become ambient noise. And decisions about what to burn, decisions that would seem monstrous or absurd in temperate climates, become simple mathematics. Your tea has cooled, not gone cold, but lost its scalding edge, and Nikolai refills your cup without asking. Tomorrow, he says, I show you the fuel shed. You'll see how we prepare. But tonight, you need to understand the enemy. The cold, it's not like storm or flood. Storm eventually stops. Flood eventually drains. Cold here? Cold is patient. Cold waits. Cold knows that eventually you run out of things to burn, and then cold wins. He's not being dramatic. He's being literal. Every winter, even now, with modern technology and supply chains, people die in Yakutia from cold-related causes. Usually it's a combination of factors. A vehicle breaks down far from shelter, a blizzard isolates a village, a generator fails, and the backup fuel is contaminated. But the ultimate cause is always the same. Heat loss exceeded heat production, and the gap couldn't be closed fast enough. You pull your blanket tighter, suddenly aware of how thin the barrier is between you and the cold. The walls of this house are thick, double-layered with sawdust insulation between, but you can still feel the cold radiating through, a subtle presence at the edge of perception. The stove, just a few meters away, is working constantly to push back against that presence, and the fuel inside it is being consumed, converted from solid matter into heat and ash, second by second, log by log. The thermodynamics are relentless. The inventory is finite, and the question remains, waiting in the darkness outside like the cold itself. What do you burn when the fire goes out? You wake the next morning to find frost inside the house. Not outside, where you'd expect it, but inside, delicate fern patterns crawling across the upper corners of the walls where warm, moist air from breathing and cooking has risen. met the freezing barrier of the outer wall, and crystallized into ice. Nikolai notices you staring and chuckles. This is nothing. Last winter, ice on inside walls got thick as my thumb. We had to chip it off with axe before weight made ceiling sag. He's making breakfast now, and you notice something peculiar about the kitchen layout. Everything is arranged in concentric circles around the stove. The table sits closest, then the food preparation area, then storage shelves, each zone precisely positioned to capture and utilize the radiating heat. This isn't accidental. This is thermal architecture, refined over centuries into an art form where every centimeter matters. Traditional Yakut dwellings, before Russian colonization introduced new building techniques, were called balagans or, in winter camps, yurtas, not to be confused with Mongolian yurts, though they share conceptual DNA. These structures were engineering marvels disguised as primitive huts, each element designed to trap heat with fanatical efficiency while using materials that were themselves potential fuel. It's a paradox. You build your shelter from the very materials you might need to burn to survive inside it. The classical balagan was a hexagonal or octagonal structure, raised slightly off the ground on wooden posts to prevent the permafrost beneath from melting and destabilizing the foundation. The walls were constructed from vertical larch poles, chosen because larch is one of the few conifers that thrives in permafrost and produces wood so dense it resists rot for decades. Between these poles, the Yakut packed a mixture of clay, grass, and horse manure, yes, manure, which when dried and mixed with other materials becomes an excellent insulator and, in dire circumstances, a slow-burning fuel. The roof was the critical innovation. Rather than a simple peak design that would shed snow, the balagan used a complex multi-layered approach. An inner layer of birch bark, waterproof, flexible, and burns well when dry. Then a thick layer of earth or sod, excellent insulation, terrible fuel. Then an outer layer of bark or wooden shingles, weather protection and, again, potential fuel. The whole assembly could be 3 feet thick at the top, creating a thermal mass that absorbed heat during the brief summer and released it slowly during the endless winter. Inside, the layout followed rigid rules. The stove, always the stove, occupied the central position with its chimney rising straight through the roof. Around it, the living space was divided into zones based on heat availability. The choicest sleeping spots were on elevated platforms closest to the stove, where rising warm air pooled. Children and elders got these positions. The coldest spots, near the walls and the entrance, went to the strongest adults who could better tolerate the temperature gradient. But here's where it gets interesting. Every structural element was designed with dual purpose. The sleeping platforms weren't just furniture, they were fuel reserves. The vertical wall poles weren't just framing, they were emergency firewood. Even the entry tunnel, most balagans had a low, narrow entrance passage that forced you to crawl, served as both a windbreak and a potential fuel source if dismantled. Nikolai is gesturing now with a piece of bread, sketching the layout in the air. My great-grandfather's balagan, which stood until 1950s, had walls you could burn from inside out. Grandfather told me story. Winter of 1928, maybe 1929, very bad winter. Herders couldn't reach village for 3 months. They run out of wood, so they start taking poles from walls. But not random, you understand? They calculated. South wall gets afternoon sun, so south wall gets burned first. North wall keeps wind out, so north wall stays until last. This isn't folklore. Soviet ethnographers documented similar practices across Siberia, noting that traditional dwellings were essentially consumable architecture. Structures designed to be gradually cannibalized if necessary, with a clear hierarchy of which parts could be sacrificed and in what order. Historians still argue whether this represents brilliant adaptation or tragic resignation, whether designing a house you might have to burn represents genius or despair. Probably both. The materials themselves tell a story of scarcity and selection. Larch, which forms the skeleton of most traditional Yakut buildings, is interesting stuff. It's a deciduous conifer. It drops its needles in winter, which seems counterproductive until you realize this prevents snow and ice from accumulating and breaking branches. The wood is incredibly dense, roughly 600 kilograms per cubic meter when dry, and it contains a high concentration of natural resins that act as preservatives. These same resins make larch an excellent fuel. When burned, Larch releases approximately 19 megajoules per kilogram, near the top of the range for softwoods, and the resin content means it ignites easily even when cold. A single larch pole, the kind used in Balagan construction, might measure 15 centimeters in diameter and 3 meters long. Call it 30 kilograms of wood, yielding roughly 570 megajoules of energy when burned. That's enough to heat a small, well-insulated space for maybe 4 to 6 hours. Now consider that a typical Balagan might use 60 to 80 such poles in its construction. That's your entire house, rendered as fuel, roughly 2,000 kilograms of wood, representing about 38,000 megajoules. Call it 10,500 kilowatt hours of energy. For reference, a modern American home uses about 900 kilowatt hours per month. Your Balagan, if completely burned for warmth, might sustain a family for roughly 11 days of continuous heating in extreme cold. 11 days. That's the lifespan of your shelter, measured in heat. Of course, nobody burns their entire house at once. The process is gradual, strategic. You start with the exterior decorative elements, carved shutters, ornamental roof pieces, the fancy entrance gate that signals prosperity. These have minimal structural importance but significant cultural value, and burning them represents the first admission that this winter is different, that normal rules are suspended. Next come the interior partitions, the walls that divide the single room into smaller spaces. These provide privacy and help trap heat in smaller zones. But in a survival situation, privacy becomes a luxury you can't afford. Burn the partitions, consolidate everyone into the warmest central area, and buy yourself another few days. Then the furniture. Furniture, we'll spend more time on this later, but for now, just note that traditional Yakut furniture was built heavy and dense specifically because it might need to double as fuel. Tables made from solid larch planks, benches carved from single logs, storage chests constructed without nails, metal being precious, but with thick wooden joints. Every piece is substantial, every piece burns hot and long, and every piece represents hours of skilled labor lost to the fire. Nikolai opens a cabinet and pulls out a wooden bowl, carved from a single piece of birch, the surface polished smooth by decades of use. This was my grandmother's. She made it herself 1940s, during the war when all the men were gone. Look at the grain, the weight. Good birch, very dense. Burns beautiful, hot, steady flame, sweet smell. He pauses, running his thumb along the rim. Would I burn this? If my children are cold? If the choice is this bowl or frozen fingers? He places it back in the cabinet carefully. Yes, I would burn it. And I would tell my grandmother's spirit I'm sorry. But she would understand. She survived 3 winters by burning things her grandmother made. This is the psychological dimension that numbers can't capture. Every item in a Yakutian household carries memory, identity, connection. That bowl isn't just wood and grain. It's a link to ancestors, a physical embodiment of continuity. Burning it doesn't just consume matter and release energy. It severs connection, erases presence. And yet, survival demands it. The birch bark that lines the Balagan roof is another fascinating material. Birch bark contains betulin, a naturally occurring compound that makes the bark waterproof and highly flammable. The Yakut harvest it in late spring when the sap is running and the bark peels off in large, flexible sheets. These sheets can be layered, sewn together with sinew or leather strips, and used for roofing, containers, even clothing. When dry, birch bark is one of the best natural fire starters in existence. It ignites easily, burns hot, around 22 megajoules per kilogram, and produces a bright, cheerful flame. A square meter of birch bark, perhaps half a centimeter thick, weighs about 300 grams and could get a dying fire roaring again within minutes. But that same square meter might be the patch keeping rain and snow out of your dwelling, and once burned, it's gone. So you make calculations. Is it raining? Snowing? If you burn the roof bark, will moisture get in and make the remaining fuel too wet to burn? Would it be better to burn the clothing you're not currently wearing, or the empty storage chest, or one of the sleeping platforms? These aren't hypothetical questions. Nikolai's family history is full of them. Winter of 1942, he says, pouring more tea. Stalin has taken all the horses for war effort. No horses means no transportation. No way to haul wood from forest. Village here almost starves, almost freezes. My grandfather, he's 11 years old, and his job every day is to go through the house and bring his father one item to burn. Every day, one item. His father chooses what, but grandfather must bring options. Some days it's easy, broken tool, cracked bucket, worn-out boot. But after 2 months, 3 months, the easy choices are gone. Grandfather tells me he brought his own child-sized chair, the one his father carved for him when he was born. He brought his mother's sewing frame. He brought wooden toys, sacred items, family heirlooms. And his father burned them all, piece by piece, keeping the fire alive until spring. Did it happen exactly this way? Oral histories are slippery, details shifting with each retelling, but the emotional truth is solid. The 1940s were catastrophic in Yakutia. War, collectivization, disrupted supply lines, forced sedentarization of nomadic peoples. Survival often did require burning the irreplaceable. Outside, you hear a diesel engine rumble to life, probably a neighbor starting their truck. Modern Yakutia has electricity, fuel deliveries, and heated garages, but the old knowledge persists because the infrastructure isn't perfectly reliable. Every few winters, something fails. A power line snaps under ice accumulation, a fuel shipment gets delayed, a generator breaks, and suddenly people need to remember what their great-grandparents knew instinctively. The architecture of survival hasn't changed. Really, it's just been supplemented. Nikolai stands and motions for you to follow him outside. You bundle up, layers upon layers, fur over wool over synthetic insulation, and step through the door. The cold hits like a physical blow, seizing your lungs, freezing the moisture in your nostrils instantly. It's perhaps minus 65 degrees Celsius right now, early morning, and the world is utterly still. No wind, no birdsong, no sound except your breathing and the crunch of boots on snow. He leads you to a structure behind the house, a shed built in the traditional style. Inside, neatly stacked floor to ceiling, is wood. Mountains of it. Larch logs, birch branches, pine kindling, even bundles of dried grass. Each type sorted, each stack organized by size. This, Nikolai says, his breath creating instant fog, is 3 years of preparation, maybe 15 cords of wood. Enough for one winter with some left over. You see, I don't ever want to choose between my grandmother's bowl and my daughter's warmth. So I prepare. But even as he says this, you both know 15 cords sounds like abundance, but it's still finite. A harsh winter, an injury that prevents wood cutting, a family emergency that pulls him away during harvesting season. Any disruption could tip the balance from comfortable to desperate. The balagan, the careful architecture, the organized fuel shed, these are all strategies to delay the terrible choices. But the cold is patient. The cold is always patient. And the question always remains. Back inside, thawing out with fresh tea, Nikolai begins the real education. The hierarchy of combustibles, ranked by practicality, energy density, and emotional cost. This is the knowledge that separates theoretical survival from actual survival, the mental catalog that every Yakut elder carries and every child absorbs through observation and necessity. We start with the obvious, he says, settling into his chair with the satisfaction of a professor beginning a favorite lecture. The fuels we gather specifically to burn. These cost us labor but not sacrifice, yes? This is the comfortable zone, where choices are easy. At the very top of the hierarchy sits dried larch. We've touched on larch already, but it deserves deeper appreciation. The Yakut have a saying, larch in autumn is gold in your hands. Harvest season, late September through early October, before the deep cold arrives, is when families venture into the taiga to fell trees, strip branches, and haul logs back to the village. It's brutal work, physically exhausting, but it's also communal, almost celebratory. Families work together, songs are sung, and there's genuine satisfaction in seeing the woodpile grow. A healthy larch can yield 300 to 500 kilograms of usable firewood. The trunk is split into logs, the branches bundled for kindling. Even the bark is saved, nothing is wasted. When properly seasoned, dried for at least a year, ideally 2, larch burns with a steady, hot flame that can maintain temperature through the night. One log, perhaps 5 kilograms, provides roughly 95 megajoules of energy. In a well-insulated home, that might translate to 3 to 4 hours of livable warmth. Next in quality is birch, which burns hotter than larch, up to 22 megajoules per kilogram, but faster. Birch is the sprint to larch's marathon. You use birch when you need to rapidly warm a cold space, when someone comes in from outside dangerously chilled, when you're cooking and need intense heat quickly. But birch depletes your woodpile faster, so you ration it, using it strategically rather than as your primary fuel. Pine comes third. It's abundant in the Yakutian taiga, easy to harvest, and splits beautifully, but it has problems. Pine is resinous, good for starting fires, terrible for overnight burns. It pops and sparks aggressively, sending embers flying, which in a wooden house can mean disaster. The Yakut use pine, but carefully, mixing it with denser woods and never leaving a primarily pine fire unattended. "My cousin Dmitri," Nikolai says with a grim shake of his head. "He got lazy one winter. Cold night, he loads stove with pine, all pine, because it's easy to split and he's tired. Then he falls asleep. Spark jumps from stove, lands on his coat hanging by the wall. Fire starts. He wakes up to smoke, manages to get out, but house is gone. Total loss. January, minus 68 degrees Celsius outside. What happened to him? Neighbors took him in. Village took care of him. But everything he owned, tools, food stores, family items, all burned. He spent rest of winter rebuilding his life one borrowed item at a time." Nikolai pauses. He's more careful now. Everyone is careful now. The story illustrates a crucial point. In Yakutia, fire is simultaneously savior and threat. You need it desperately, but it's also the thing most likely to destroy you. Carbon monoxide from poor ventilation, house fires from sparks, smoke inhalation from cracked stovepipes. Fire claims lives every winter, even as it saves vastly more. The relationship is intimate and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance. Below the premium woods in the hierarchy comes the scrub fuel. Willow branches, dried grasses, bundled straw. These are gathered in late summer and stored in massive quantities because they burn fast and produce less heat per kilogram, maybe 12 to 15 megajoules for dry grass. But they're useful for transitional moments. Starting fires, boosting a dying flame, filling gaps in the burning schedule. Then there's the fuel that makes visitors uncomfortable. Dung. Nikolai notices your expression and grins. Ah yes, the famous Yakut dung fires. Western visitors always make faces. But I tell you, dried horse dung is excellent fuel. Not as good as wood, maybe 14 to 16 megajoules per kilogram, but very available if you keep animals. Burns slow, makes steady heat, very little smoke when properly dried. He's not exaggerating. Pastoral cultures across Central Asia and Siberia have used dried animal dung as fuel for millennia. The Yakut, who traditionally herded horses and cattle adapted to extreme cold, had abundant access to this resource. Fresh dung is useless. Too wet, produces acrid smoke. But dung dried for several months becomes lightweight, crumbly, and surprisingly pleasant burning. The collection process is undignified but necessary. Children are often assigned this task, gathering dung in summer and autumn, stacking it in protected areas to dry. A healthy horse produces roughly 15 to 20 kilograms of dung per day. Over a 6-month grazing season, that's nearly 3,000 kilograms per animal. Even accounting for moisture loss during drying, you're looking at 600 to 800 kilograms of usable fuel per horse per year. For a family keeping 3 or 4 horses, that's a significant fuel supplement, enough to stretch the wood supply considerably. And here's the key: dung is renewable. Trees take decades to reach useful size. Horses produce fuel daily. In an environment where wood is precious and labor-intensive to harvest, this matters enormously. Of course, Nikolai adds, in Soviet times, authorities tried to ban dung burning, said it was primitive, uncivilized. They wanted everyone using coal or electric heat. But coal costs money. Electricity fails in storms. Dung is free, reliable. So people kept quiet and kept burning dung in private. He shrugs. Ideology doesn't keep you warm. This tension between traditional knowledge and modernization runs throughout Yakut history. Soviet-era policies often dismissed indigenous practices as backward, pushing industrial solutions that worked beautifully in Moscow but failed catastrophically in Siberia. Centralized heating systems that couldn't withstand minus 70 degrees Celsius. Apartment blocks with insufficient insulation. Coal deliveries that didn't arrive because rivers froze early and roads became impassable. The Yakut who secretly maintained their traditional fuel stocks, who kept their knowledge of dung burning and would management alive despite official disapproval, were the ones who survived the winters when modern systems failed. Below dung on the hierarchy, we enter the realm of materials not specifically gathered as fuel but useful in emergencies. Bark scraps, sawdust compressed into blocks, wood chips from carpentry work, broken wooden tools. These are the marginal fuels, the ones you burn without regret but also without abundance. Nikolai shows you a basket filled with what looks like large, dark pellets. Sawdust mixed with animal fat, compressed, he explains. My grandfather's recipe. You take sawdust from woodworking, we waste nothing, remember. Mix it with rendered fat from butchering, form it into balls, let it harden. Each ball burns for maybe 20-30 minutes. Good for overnight fire maintenance. It's a clever hack, increasing the energy density of waste sawdust by adding fat. Remember, fat is roughly 37 megajoules per kilogram. A sawdust fat ball might weigh 100 grams and contain perhaps 18 to 20 megajoules of energy, similar to a decent wood log but in a more concentrated, controllable package. Plus, it uses materials that would otherwise be discarded. This kind of innovation, squeezing maximum utility from every scrap, is endemic to cold climate survival cultures. Nothing is wasted because waste is literally throwing heat away, and heat is life. Now we get to the interesting part, Nikolai says, leaning forward, the part where comfort ends and calculation begins. We're done with the designated fuels. Everything below here is something we need for another purpose, something we'd prefer not to burn. But cold doesn't care about our preferences. He gestures around the room. Look at this house. Really look. What do you see? You scan the interior. Wooden table, wooden chairs, wooden shelves, wooden storage chests, wooden frames around windows, wooden paneling on walls, wooden beams supporting the ceiling. The house is fundamentally a stack of organized wood, temporarily arranged as shelter but theoretically available as fuel. Exactly, Nikolai says, reading your expression. This house is maybe 8,000 kilograms of wood. If I burned it all evenly, efficiently, it would keep this space warm for, let's see, maybe 2 months in deep winter, 3 if I'm very careful and lucky with weather. He's running the math aloud. 8,000 kilograms times 18 megajoules per kilogram equals 144,000 megajoules. At peak winter cold, maintaining 20 degrees Celsius inside when it's minus 70 degrees Celsius outside requires roughly 5 to 6 kilowatts of continuous heat input in a small, well-insulated dwelling. That's 18 to 22 megajoules per hour, 432 to 528 megajoules per day. So 144,000 megajoules divided by 480 megajoules per day equals roughly 300 days. But that assumes perfect efficiency, which is impossible. Real-world efficiency in a traditional stove is maybe 50 to 60%, so have that figure. 150 days. Call it 5 months. 5 months, you say aloud. 5 months, Nikolai confirms. And winter here lasts 6, sometimes 7. You see the problem? Even if you're willing to burn your entire house, even if you sacrifice everything, it's barely enough. This is why preparation is everything. This is why we harvest wood obsessively, why we store dung, why we never, ever assume we have enough. The calculation is horrifying in its implications. Even total commitment to burning everything. Every stick of furniture, every structural beam, every decorative element, only barely meets the thermal budget of a Yakutian winter. There's almost no margin for error, no room for waste, no forgiveness for poor planning. And we haven't even discussed the items that hurt to burn, the ones that carry value beyond their caloric content. Nikolai stands and walks to the corner of the room where several items lean against the wall. A wooden sled, beautifully crafted, with carved runners and leather bindings. This sled, my father made it for me when I was 8. Spent whole summer carving, fitting, adjusting. I used it for 20 years hauling wood, ice supplies. My children used it. My grandchildren use it now. He runs his hand along the smooth wood, his touch gentle, almost reverent. Dry larch, maybe 12 kilograms. Burns excellent. Could keep us warm for, what, 8 hours? 10? Would you burn it? If I had to, yes. But not yet. Not while I have logs in the shed. Not while I have furniture I didn't make with my own hands. Not while I have options. He pauses. But if those options run out? If it's the sled or my family freezes? I burn the sled. And I tell my father's memory I'm sorry. And I promise to build another when spring comes. This is the transition point, the moment when fuel hierarchy becomes emotional hierarchy. The next choices aren't about maximizing energy or minimizing waste. They're about what you can bear to lose, what you can sacrifice and still remain yourself. And we're only halfway through the inventory. The table sits between you and Nikolai, solid and scarred. Its surface marked by decades of knife cuts, hot pots, and spilled tea. It's made from a single massive larch plank, perhaps 8 centimeters thick and 2 meters long, supported by thick legs mortised directly into the top. No nails, no screws, just wood fitted to wood with the precision that comes from careful handwork and understanding of how timber expands and contracts with temperature changes. This table, Nikolai says, placing both palms flat on the surface, has been in my family since 1957. My grandfather built it the year my father was born. Every meal I ate as a child, I ate at this table. My wedding feast was served on this table. My children learned to write on this table. He pauses, his jaw working slightly. This table weighs maybe 45 kilograms. Dry larch, very dense. Burns 4, maybe 2 days of constant fire. Maybe 3 if I'm careful. 2 days. The lifespan of family history, measured in heat. Would you burn it? He doesn't answer immediately. Outside, the wind has picked up. Not a gale, just a steady breath of minus 70 degrees Celsius air probing for weaknesses in the walls, for gaps in the insulation, for any pathway to steal warmth. The stove ticks and mutters, consuming wood that Nikolai harvested last autumn, wood that will become ash and memory in a few hours. I don't know, he finally says. I want to say yes because I'm practical, because I know survival matters more than sentiment. But I've never had to make that choice. I've always had enough wood, enough dung, enough fuel. Ask me again when I'm burning the last log from my shed and my children are shivering and the temperature outside is minus 75 degrees Celsius with no relief forecast for a week. He looks at you directly. Then I'll give you an honest answer. This is where the hierarchy becomes truly personal, where the neat categories of energy density and burn duration collide with human attachment and identity. Furniture isn't just wood arranged into useful shapes. It's the physical infrastructure of daily life, the objects around which routines organize, the things your hands touch 100 times a day without thinking. The chairs around Nikolai's table are mismatched, each one a different style, collected over years. One is clearly old, the wood darkened almost to black with age and hand oil. My great-grandmother's chair, Nikolai says, following your gaze. Made from birch, very heavy. She sat in this chair every day for 40 years. When she died, my grandmother inherited it. Then my mother. Then me. How much does it weigh? Maybe 8 kilograms. Birch, remember, 22 megajoules per kilogram. So roughly 176 megajoules total. In this house, in deep winter, that's maybe 12 hours of warmth. 12 hours. Half a day. The market value of great-grandmother's chair, denominated in heat. But here's the cruel mathematics. 12 hours might be exactly the difference between freezing and surviving until rescue arrives. 12 hours might span the gap between a deadly blizzard and a clear morning when you can reach the neighbor's fuel shed. 12 hours might be the margin that saves a child's fingers from frostbite or keeps an elder's heart beating through the coldest part of the night. So yes, you burn the chair. You burn it and you grieve and you survive. The same calculus applies to every piece of furniture. The shelves holding food stores and family items. perhaps 15 kilograms of wood each, good for 18 to 24 hours of heat. The storage chests, beautifully dovetailed and carved, 20 kilograms each, maybe 30 hours. The bed frames, massive things built to support not just sleepers but also the thick layers of furs and blankets necessary in Yakutia winters, 40 kilograms or more, 2 or 3 days of warmth. Nikolai walks you through his mental inventory, pointing at each item and reciting its weight, its wood type, its approximate burn time. It's clearly a calculation he's run many times, a disaster scenario he's rehearsed in his mind even if he's never had to execute it. Every Yakut elder does this, passing the knowledge to the next generation not through formal instruction but through casual observation and carefully chosen stories. "The bed my wife and I sleep on," he says, gesturing toward the bedroom, "is pine. I built it myself 20 years ago using trees I felled and milled. Maybe 50 kilograms of wood in the frame. Burns hot but fast. Pine problems, remember? Would give us maybe 2 days of heat, but risky because of sparks. So it's lower priority than the larch furniture?" "Exactly. I burn larch first because it's safer and burns longer. Pine I save for when I'm desperate enough that I don't care about risk, when I need intense heat immediately and I'm willing to watch the stove constantly to prevent sparks from escaping. This is risk layering, another dimension of the hierarchy. Some fuels are technically excellent but dangerous to use, so they're reserved for situations where the danger of not burning them exceeds the danger of burning them. This triage, constantly recalculating which threat is more immediate. The door represents a special category of painful choice. Doors are boundary markers, barriers between inside and outside, between warm and cold, between safe and exposed. A door also happens to be a large, flat piece of wood. Nikolai's front door is solid larch, perhaps 30 kilograms, good for a day and a half of heat. "But burn the door," Nikolai says, "and you lose wind protection. Cold air pours in directly. You also lose security from animals, from thieves, from strangers, and you lose privacy, dignity. Anyone can walk into your home, see you at your most vulnerable." He's describing the cascading consequences of burning structural elements. Furniture is painful but doesn't compromise the house's integrity. The door, the window frames, the wall paneling, these are defensive barriers, and removing them weakens your position even as it provides immediate warmth. So when do you burn the door? When you've burned everything else and you're still cold. Or when the blizzard is so bad that nobody will be outside anyway, so security doesn't matter. Or, he hesitates, when you know you're not going to survive in this house anyway, when the situation is so desperate that you're just trying to stay alive long enough to make it to a neighbor's home or a rescue shelter. It's a grim thought, burning your door as acknowledgement that you've already lost, that survival now means abandoning the space entirely and the door is just delaying the inevitable by a few hours. But those hours might matter. They almost always matter. The window frames come with similar trade-offs. Each frame is perhaps 5 to 8 kilograms of wood, good for 10 to 12 hours of heat. But windows are your only source of natural light during the brief daylight hours, and they allow you to monitor conditions outside. Is the storm clearing? Is smoke rising from the neighbor's chimney, indicating they're still alive? Is that a rescue party approaching? Remove the window frames and you lose visual connection to the world. You also create gaps that let in wind, unless you seal them with skins or cloth, which requires materials you might not have. And once again, you're dismantling the structure that protects you, trading long-term shelter integrity for short-term heat. Historians have documented cases, particularly during the famines of the 1930s and the supply disruptions of the 1940s, where entire villages descended into architectural cannibalism, houses being systematically dismantled from the inside, families burning their homes piece by piece through the winter and then attempting to rebuild in the spring. Some succeeded. Many didn't. Those who burned too much too quickly found themselves exposed to the cold with months of winter remaining, forced to crowd into neighbors' homes or, in extreme cases, to abandon the village entirely and attempt a deadly winter migration to larger towns. Nikolai shows you a photograph, old and faded, showing a row of houses in various states of collapse. This is from 1947, village about 100 kilometers from here. Bad winter, very bad. Supply routes frozen, no deliveries for months. By spring, half the houses looked like this, roofs gone, walls missing, burned for warmth. Some families died anyway. Others survived but lost everything. The photograph is haunting. You can see the desperation in the missing sections, the gaps where doors and frames once stood, the sagging structures half devoured by their own occupants. It's architecture as autophagy, buildings consuming themselves in a futile attempt to sustain the life within. Could that happen now? Nikolai considers. Less likely. We have better supply chains, better communication, helicopters for emergencies. But possible? Yes, always possible. This is Yakutia. Cold doesn't care about your supply chains or your helicopters. Cold just waits for mistakes. He stands and adds another log to the stove, larch, you notice, selected carefully from the pile beside the firebox. The log is about 4 kilograms, which means it represents roughly 75 megajoules of energy, which means it will sustain the current temperature for approximately 3 to 4 hours before another log is needed. The arithmetic is relentless, each log a tick of the survival clock. Now we come to the personal items, Nikolai says. The things that have no practical function except memory and meaning. These are hardest to rank because their value isn't in their wood content. It's in what they represent. He opens a cabinet and removes a small wooden box, perhaps 15 centimeters on each side, intricately carved with traditional Yakut patterns, geometric designs representing sun, moon, animals, and abstract symbols whose meanings have been partially lost to time. My grandmother carved this. Inside, she kept her sewing needles, thread, small treasures. When she died, it passed to my mother. When my mother died, to me. How much does it weigh? Maybe 300 grams. Birch, very dense. Burns for, what, 2 hours? Maybe less. 2 hours. The sentimental value is infinite. The thermal value is negligible. And yet, if you're 1 hour away from frostbite, if you're 90 minutes from losing consciousness to hypothermia, that box becomes the most valuable object in the world. Not for what it means, but for what it burns into. I have never seriously considered burning this, Nikolai admits. Even in my worst-case planning, I skip over items like this. I tell myself I'll burn the table first, the chairs, the bed, even the door before I burn my grandmother's sewing box. But he replaces it carefully in the cabinet. If my daughter is dying of cold and I've burned everything else, yes, I burn the box, and I ask my grandmother to forgive me because she would have done the same. This is the emotional architecture of survival, the hierarchy written not in joules and kilograms but in guilt and grief. Every item you burn carries weight beyond its mass, and the decisions accumulate, layering trauma on top of trauma until survival itself becomes a kind of haunting. The wooden toys his grandfather carved for him as a child. Burn them? The frame holding his wedding photograph. Burn it? The carved spoon his father used every day for 60 years. Burn it? Yes, yes, and yes if the alternative is death. But each act of burning is also an act of severance, cutting ties to the past, to identity, to the continuity that makes us more than just biological organisms fighting cold. You survive, but what remains of you? If you burn every object that connects you to your history, to your family, to your culture, are you still Yakut? Still yourself? Philosophers and anthropologists have written extensively about material culture, about how objects serve as external memory, as anchors for identity. In most contexts, this is abstract theory. In Yakutia, it's survival calculus. How much of yourself can you burn and still be you? Nikolai pours more tea, and you both sit in silence for a moment, listening to the stove's steady rumble, to the wind testing the walls, to the house itself creaking and settling as temperature differentials expand and contract the wood. Tomorrow, he finally says, we talk about the things nobody wants to discuss, the fuels that aren't wood or furniture or sentimental items, the biological fuels, the things we carry on our bodies and the things we store for other purposes but which can, in extremis, be burned. Your tea suddenly tastes different, though nothing has changed except the conversation's trajectory. But tonight, Nikolai adds, glancing at the window where darkness has fully settled, rest. Think about what we've discussed. Think about your own home, your own possessions. What would you burn first? What would you burn last? What would you refuse to burn, even if it meant dying with that refusal? It's not a comfortable question. It's not meant to be. Morning arrives with the peculiar luminescence of deep winter, the sky brightening from black to deep blue to a pale, anemic gray that passes for daylight this far north. The sun, when it finally appears, barely clears the horizon, offering light without warmth, illumination without comfort. You've slept fitfully, your dreams filled with burning furniture and endless calculations of weight versus heat, memory versus survival. Nikolai is already awake, of course, tending the fire that cannot be allowed to die. He's added fresh logs overnight. You can see the charred remnants of the previous load and the new wood actively combusting, flames licking along the grain. The stove is the heartbeat of this house, its rhythm measured in logs consumed and heat produced, and Nikolai is its constant guardian. Today we discuss what makes people uncomfortable, he says without preamble, handing you tea. We talk about burning what we wear and what we are. You understand immediately. Clothing, bodily fats, the biological materials that, in the grimmest scenarios, become fuel not because you want them to but because physics doesn't care about your comfort level with the topic. Let's start with the easier part, Nikolai continues. Clothing. You're wearing, what, 5-6 layers? Each layer is material. Each material can burn. You mentally inventory yourself. Synthetic thermal underwear, wool shirt, fleece pullover, down jacket, outer shell of treated canvas. On your legs, thermal leggings, wool pants, waterproof overpants. On your feet, wool socks, felt liners, leather boots. On your hands, liner gloves, mittens. On your head, wool cap, fur-lined hood. It's easily 4 to 5 kilograms of material, maybe more. And yes, almost all of it is combustible. Traditional Yakut winter clothing, Nikolai explains, was primarily animal-based. Reindeer fur, horsehide, sheep wool, sometimes bear or wolf skin for the wealthiest families. Modern clothing adds synthetics, nylon, polyester, down-filling, rubber soles, but the principle is the same. You're wearing insulation, and insulation is material, and material can burn. The energy content varies wildly by fabric type. Natural wool, when completely dry, contains roughly 20 megajoules per kilogram, comparable to decent firewood. Leather is slightly less, around 18 megajoules per kilogram. Animal fur, with its combination of hair and hide, falls somewhere in between. Synthetic materials are often petroleum-based, which means they can contain 30 to 40 megajoules per kilogram, but they burn dirty, producing toxic smoke and melting into dangerous residues. But here's the problem, Nikolai says, pulling off one of his own boots to demonstrate. This boot weighs maybe 800 grams. Half leather, half rubber, some felt lining. When I burn it, I get maybe 12 megajoules? Enough for 2, maybe 3 hours of heat. 3 hours seems worth it if you're freezing. Ah, but think further. I burn my boots now, I have heat for 3 hours. But tomorrow, when I need to go outside to fetch more wood, to check the animals, to dig out the door after a blizzard, how do I do this with no boots? I freeze my feet in minutes. I lose toes, maybe whole feet. Then I can't walk, can't work, can't survive even if I have fuel. It's the paradox of burning clothing. The immediate heat gain is offset by the loss of insulation and protection for future needs. Clothing is both fuel and shield, and burning it means trading one form of survival currency for another. Historians documenting the Soviet labor camps in Siberia, the Gulag system that persisted from the 1930s through the 1950s, recorded numerous instances of prisoners burning their own clothing for warmth, only to die days later from exposure because they no longer had adequate protection. The camps were deliberately undersupplied, part of the system's cruelty, and inmates faced impossible calculations. Freeze tonight or burn your coat and freeze tomorrow. Many chose to burn. Many died either way. Nikolai is describing a more nuanced strategy, one that reflects generations of accumulated wisdom rather than camp desperation. You burn clothing strategically in order of replaceability and functional redundancy. You never burn what you're currently wearing. That's insanity. You burn what you've taken off, what you have duplicates of, what serves the least critical function. He walks you through the hierarchy. First to burn, extra layers, backup clothing, spare socks. If you have 2 wool shirts and you're wearing one, the second becomes fuel. It hurts, replacement might be impossible, but it doesn't immediately compromise your protection. Next, damaged or worn items. The coat with a torn sleeve, the pants with holes, the mittens where the lining has separated. These still provide some insulation, but they're already failing. Better to extract their heat value before they become completely useless. Then, specialized items you can substitute. Perhaps you have both a fur hat and a wool cap. You can wear one and burn the other, accepting slightly reduced protection but maintaining basic coverage. Only in extreme circumstances, the clothing you're actively wearing. And even then, you choose carefully. Perhaps you burn your outer shell but keep your inner layers, or vice versa depending on whether you need wind protection or insulation more critically. My uncle told me a story, Nikolai says, settling back into his chair. Winter of 1953, he's traveling between villages, maybe 30 kilometers. Weather turns bad, blizzard comes up, he can't see, can't navigate. He finds a small cave, decides to wait out the storm. But he has no wood, no fuel. Temperature is dropping, he can feel hypothermia starting. Hands shaking, thinking getting fuzzy. So he starts burning his clothing. First his spare shirt, stuffed into a crack in the rock and lit with his last match. It burns maybe 20 minutes, gives him enough warmth to stop shivering, to think clearly. Then he burns one boot, just one, keeps the other. Burns his belt. Burns the leather straps from his pack. Each item buys him another hour, maybe 2. The storm lasts through the night. By morning, he's wearing almost nothing, one boot, pants with no belt, shirt, basic layers. But he's alive and the sky is clear. He walks the remaining distance to the village mostly barefoot, wrapping his exposed foot in cloth torn from his shirt. Gets severe frostbite, loses 3 toes. But he lives. Would he have survived if he hadn't burned his clothing? No, absolutely not. The cold would have taken him within 4-5 hours. By burning strategic pieces, he stretched his survival window to 12 hours, which was enough. The mathematics are brutal but clear. Each clothing item contains a measurable amount of thermal energy, and each provides a measurable amount of insulation. The trick, the terrible, necessary trick, is calculating which function is more valuable at any given moment. There's also the quality of the burn to consider. Wool burns slowly and relatively cleanly when dry, but if it's damp from sweat or snow, it smolders inefficiently, producing more smoke than heat. Leather is similar, dry leather burns well. Wet leather barely combusts at all. Synthetic fabrics can flare intensely but briefly, and the smoke is genuinely toxic, containing compounds that can damage your lungs even as the heat warms you. This is why preparation includes multiple sets of clothing, Nikolai says. Not for fashion, not for variety, for fuel insurance. Extra boots, extra coats, extra layers mean you have burning options that don't immediately leave you exposed. But clothing, even in abundance, represents finite energy. A complete set of traditional Yakut winter gear, full fur coat, leather pants, felt boots, fur hat, mittens, might weigh 8 to 10 kilograms total. At roughly 20 megajoules per kilogram, that's 160 to 200 megajoules, enough to heat a small space for maybe a day, perhaps slightly more if you're very efficient. One day, your entire wardrobe, everything protecting you from minus 70 degrees Celsius, converted to heat. One day of warmth. Now we come to the part that disturbs people, Nikolai says quietly. The fuel we carry in our bodies. You know where this is going, but hearing it stated plainly still creates a visceral discomfort. Humans are mammals. Mammals store energy as fat. Fat burns. This is just biology, yes? No morality, no judgment. Just chemistry and desperation. He's right, of course. Adipose tissue body fat is essentially a hydrocarbon fuel storage system. Pure fat contains approximately 37 megajoules per kilogram, making it more energy-dense than wood, comparable to diesel fuel. An average adult might carry 10 to 25 kilograms of body fat, representing anywhere from 370 to 925 megajoules of stored chemical energy. But you can't burn your own fat in a fire. It's inside you, integrated into your physiology, serving crucial functions beyond energy storage, insulation, organ protection, hormone regulation. The only way to burn your body fat is metabolically, through your body's normal processes, which is exactly what happens when you're starving and freezing simultaneously. When you're cold and you have no food, Nikolai explains, your body starts consuming itself. First it breaks down glycogen stores in your liver and muscles that lasts maybe a day. Then it moves to fat, burning it to generate heat and maintain core temperature. An average person can survive maybe 4-5 weeks on body fat alone if they're warm. But when you're cold, when your body is burning everything it can just to stay at 37 degrees Celsius. Maybe 1 week, 2 at most. This is survival cannibalism of the self, your metabolism consuming your own tissues to fuel the furnace of core temperature. And it's inefficient. Your body at peak thermogenic output might generate 300 to 400 watts, 3 to 4 times normal, but this still isn't enough at minus 70 degrees Celsius. You burn through your reserves while still slowly, inevitably cooling. The historical record from Siberian survival situations, shipwrecks in Arctic waters, lost expeditions, siege conditions, consistently shows that people died with substantial body fat remaining because the rate of heat loss exceeded the rate at which their metabolism could mobilize stored energy. You literally freeze to death while still carrying fuel inside you that you cannot access quickly enough. But there's another context where body fat becomes external fuel, and Nikolai approaches it carefully, watching your reaction. In the absolute worst situations, when someone has died and others are still alive and freezing, bodies contain fat, renderable fat, burnable fat. He's talking about the unthinkable, extracting fat from deceased humans to burn as fuel. This happened? You ask. There are stories, old stories from the worst winters, the famine years, the times when entire villages were dying. Stories of survival parties trapped by storms, people dying one by one, survivors facing the choice of freezing with the dead or using them. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice was. Documentation is sparse, partly because survivors who might have engaged in it would be unlikely to admit it, partly because record-keeping in remote Siberian villages during crisis periods was essentially non-existent. But there are mentions in Soviet ethnographic studies, carefully worded references to extreme fuel scarcity measures, and desperate repurposing of biological materials. The chemistry is straightforward. Human subcutaneous fat, when rendered, heated until it liquefies and separates from water and protein, becomes tallow, which burns readily in lamps or can be added to other fuels to increase their energy density. A deceased adult might yield 5 to 15 kilograms of renderable fat, representing 185 to 555 megajoules, perhaps 3 to 7 days of supplemental heat for a small group. Would you do it? Nikolai asks directly. If your children were freezing, if your wife was dying of hypothermia, if your own father had just died from the cold, and you knew his body contained fat that could keep the rest of you alive for another week until rescue arrived, would you? It's not a rhetorical question. He wants an answer. I don't know. I want to say no, that there are lines you don't cross, but I'm sitting here warm and fed and safe. I don't know what I'd do in actual desperation. Nikolai nods slowly. Honest answer. Better than pretending you know. I'll tell you what my grandfather told me. The living are more important than the dead. The dead are beyond cold, beyond suffering. If using their bodies saves the living, they would want this. We honor them by surviving, not by dying alongside them out of sentiment. It's a pragmatic, almost brutal philosophy, but it comes from a culture where winter death was common enough that rituals and beliefs evolved to accommodate it. The Yakut traditionally practiced sky burial in summer, bodies left on platforms for nature to reclaim, partly because the permafrost made earth burial nearly impossible, but also because the culture understood decay and recycling as natural processes, not desecrations. Extending that understanding to emergency fuel use requires a psychological framework that most modern cultures lack. But in the context of Yakutian survival, it makes a certain harsh sense. I have never had to do this, Nikolai says firmly. Never been close. But I know that I would if necessary. And I've told my family, if I die in winter and my body can keep them alive, they should use it. Every part. Nothing wasted. Outside, the pale sun has reached its apex. offering perhaps 3 hours of weak illumination before darkness returns. The temperature, according to the thermometer visible through the window, has climbed to a balmy minus 63 degrees Celsius. Nikolai adds another log to the fire. The hierarchy continues. The afternoon settles into a peculiar stillness, the kind of quiet that only extreme cold can produce. No insects, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the occasional crack of a freezing tree and the ever-present whisper of wind probing for entry points. Nikolai has made a simple lunch, reindeer stew with root vegetables, and you eat in contemplative silence, both of you aware that the conversation has crossed into territory where most people never venture, even in thought. There are fuels, Nikolai finally says, setting down his bowl, that exist in a space between material and taboo. Things that technically burn, that people have burned in the past, but that we don't discuss in polite company. Not because they're ineffective, some are quite good, actually, but because using them means you've descended below the level where civilization operates. You wait, knowing he'll continue when ready. Bone, he says. Animal bone. Human bone. Bones burn. Did you know this? You didn't, actually. In your mind, bone is stone-like, inert, the permanent scaffold that remains after everything else has decayed. But Nikolai is shaking his head at your expression. Bones are not stone. They're mostly calcium phosphate, yes, but also collagen, proteins, fat, especially marrow fat. Fresh bones are maybe 40% organic material by weight. Dried bones, less but still significant. And organic material burns. He's correct. Bone has been used as fuel throughout human history. Archaeological sites from the Paleolithic era show evidence of bone-fueled fires, particularly in regions where wood was scarce. The energy content of bone varies depending on type and moisture content, but dried bone can yield roughly 10 to 15 megajoules per kilogram, somewhat less than wood, but still substantial. The catch is that bone doesn't burn easily on its own. It requires high initial temperatures to ignite and burns slowly, incompletely, producing acrid smoke and leaving behind chalky residue. But mixed with other fuels, a few bones added to a wood fire, for instance, it extends burn time and adds heat. In the old days, Nikolai says, after butchering a reindeer or horse, nothing was wasted. Meat for eating, hide for clothing and shelter, sinew for thread, organs for various uses. And bones? The long bones, the ones with marrow, were cracked open and the marrow eaten or rendered for fat. Very nutritious, very valuable. But the remaining bone fragments, the vertebrae, the skull pieces, these went into a pile. Dried over summer. Burned in winter when wood ran low. It's efficient, almost elegant in its completeness. An animal provides calories for eating and calories for burning, nutrition and heat from a single source. A full reindeer skeleton might weigh 15 to 20 kilograms, yielding perhaps 150 to 250 megajoules when burned, enough for a day or two of supplemental heat. But sometimes, Nikolai continues, his voice dropping slightly, the bones being burned weren't animal. You feel your stomach tighten. I told you yesterday about using body fat from the deceased. Bones are the same calculus, just harder to think about. A human skeleton weighs 4 to 6 kilograms in an adult, maybe 50 to 70 megajoules of fuel value. Not much, but in the mathematics of desperation, every megajoule counts. He pauses, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue. There's a specific story in my family, passed down, probably changed in the telling but rooted in something true. Winter of 1601 or 1602, long before Russian contact, before written records here. Small hunting camp, maybe 15 people, gets trapped by early snowfall. They're a week's travel from the main settlement, and the snow just keeps coming. Weeks turn into months. They run out of food, then out of prepared fuel. They start burning the camp structures, then their tools, then their sleds, everything wooden. By the time the snow clears enough for them to attempt travel, half the group has died starvation, cold, disease. The survivors make it back to the main settlement, barely, and the elders notice something. The dead weren't brought back. Their bodies weren't recovered for proper burial rites. And the survivors won't talk about what happened in detail, but they're alive and the dead are gone. The implication being that the survivors used everything the dead had to offer. Clothing for warmth, body fat for fuel, and yes, bones for the fire. Every calorie, every joule of heat, extracted and utilized because the alternative was joining the dead. Whether this specific story is true or apocryphal doesn't really matter. It exists in the oral tradition because it represents a recognized possibility, a line that can be crossed when survival demands it. Historians studying extreme survival situations, the Donner Party, the Franklin expedition, various Arctic disasters, have documented that when starvation and cold combine, people will consume and utilize human remains to extend survival time. The Yakut cultural framework, with its pragmatic approach to death and its understanding of bodies as temporary vessels, seems to have accommodated this possibility more readily than European cultures, where religious and social prohibitions created enormous psychological barriers. Would modern Yakut people do this? You ask. Nikolai considers carefully. Modern Yakut people have supply chains, radio communication, helicopter rescue. We don't get trapped for months with no contact. So practically, the situation doesn't arise. But if it did, if somehow a group got isolated under conditions like the old stories describe, he shrugs. Some would, some wouldn't. But the knowledge that it's possible, that it's been done before, that survival sometimes requires it, this knowledge still exists in our culture. He stands and walks to the window, looking out at the pale landscape. You know what's interesting? In Western survival guides, in your books and television shows, they talk about eating insects, drinking urine, eating tree bark, things that are psychologically disgusting but provide minimal actual nutrition or benefit. But they almost never discuss burning human remains for heat, even though the energy value is substantial and the dead have no use for that energy. Because it's taboo. Because it's taboo, he agrees. But taboos are cultural constructs. They change based on context. In Yakutia, the taboo against waste, against letting usable resources go unused when people are dying, was often stronger than the taboo against using human remains. It's a perspective that challenges fundamental assumptions about the universality of certain prohibitions, suggesting that different survival environments produce different moral frameworks, each adapted to local realities. There are other fuels in this category, Nikolai says, returning to his chair. Fish oil, whale blubber, seal fat. The coastal Yakut and their neighbors to the north and east used these extensively. Blubber lamps were the primary heat and light source for Arctic cultures throughout human history. Oil lamps represent a different combustion technology than wood fires. Instead of burning solid material directly, you're burning vaporized fuel with a wick, which produces steady, controllable heat and surprisingly little smoke if done correctly. A seal oil lamp, properly maintained, can burn for hours on relatively little fuel while producing enough heat to keep a small space above freezing. The energy density is extraordinary. Seal blubber contains roughly 38 to 40 megajoules per kilogram, similar to diesel fuel. A single seal might yield 30 to 50 kilograms of blubber, representing 1,140 to 2,000 megajoules, enough to heat a dwelling for weeks if carefully rationed. But here in Yakutia, we're far from the ocean, Nikolai notes. Seals aren't available. Fish oil, though, this we had. Lake and river fish, particularly fatty species like whitefish and broad whitefish, could be rendered for oil. Not as rich as marine mammals, maybe 25 to 30 megajoules per kilogram, but still valuable. He describes the process. Fish caught in summer or autumn, the fattiest specimens set aside, flesh removed and dried for eating, heads and organs rendered in large pots over fire. The resulting oil, thick, pungent, deeply unpleasant to modern sensibilities, would be stored in sealed containers, preserved for winter use. My great-great-grandmother kept fish oil lamps burning through the darkest months. Small lamps, very economical, just enough light to work by and a bit of supplemental heat. The smell was terrible, my grandmother said, but you got used to it, and it meant the wood supply lasted longer. The shift from fish oil lamps to petroleum kerosene, when it became available through Russian trade in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was apparently enthusiastically adopted. Kerosene burns cleaner, smells better, and is easier to store. But the knowledge of fish oil rendering persisted, just in case modern fuels became unavailable. During the Great Patriotic War, Nikolai says, using the Russian term for World War II, when fuel deliveries stopped and villages were isolated, people went back to the old methods. Rendered fish oil, burned seal fat if they could trade for it, used every traditional technique their grandparents knew. The generation born in the 1930s and 40s, they grew up with one foot in the traditional world and one in the modern, and they remembered everything. That's the generation teaching my generation now. This intergenerational transmission of survival knowledge is itself a survival adaptation. Cultures that maintain redundant knowledge systems, that don't allow critical skills to be forgotten during prosperous times, are more resilient when conditions deteriorate. You're struck by how the hierarchy of fuels we've discussed isn't really linear. It's more like a network of options, each with different trade-offs, each suitable for different scenarios. Wood for general heating, dung for supplemental fuel, furniture when wood runs low, clothing when furniture is gone, bone and fat when you're utilizing every part of an animal or, unthinkably, every part of deceased humans, oil for lamps, rendered blubber if you can access it. And none of it is enough, not really. Even if you use everything, even if you burn every possible material with perfect efficiency, winter in Yakutia is so long and so cold that the energy budget barely balances. You can do everything right and still die if luck turns against you. A longer winter than usual, an early snow that prevents final fuel gathering, an illness that keeps you from maintaining the fire properly. There's one more category, Nikolai says, almost reluctantly. The things that people burn when they've lost their minds, when desperation has become derangement, when they're no longer making rational survival choices but just grasping at anything. Like what? Like sacred objects, religious items, things that the culture says must never be destroyed because they hold spiritual power or ancestral connection. He pauses. The Yakut have, or had, shaman drums, carved idols, ceremonial items made from wood and bone and hide. These were forbidden to burn, not because of their material value. Actually, some were quite substantial, heavy wooden carvings that would burn for hours, but because burning them was believed to sever the connection between the living and the spirit world, to bring curse and misfortune. But people burned them anyway? Some did. When faced with the choice between freezing to death or violating sacred prohibition, some people chose to live and accept the spiritual consequences. Others refused, dying rather than commit what they saw as unforgivable transgression. Historians still argue about how to interpret these accounts. Are they evidence of genuine religious devotion or rationalization of psychological breaking points? When someone refuses to burn a sacred drum and freezes to death, are they martyring themselves for their faith, or have they simply succumbed to hypothermic confusion and decision paralysis? My great-grandfather had a carved wooden figure, passed down from his grandmother, supposedly blessed by a shaman in the 1700s. Family legends said it protected the household, ensured healthy children, good hunts, mild winters. When he died, it passed to my grandfather. When my grandfather's house caught fire in 1968, unrelated to fuel burning, just bad luck with a stovepipe, he ran back inside to save this figure. Nearly died. Got it out, though. It sits in my house now. Would you burn it? To save my daughter's life? Yes. To save my own life? I honestly don't know. Maybe I'd decide the curse or the spiritual consequence was worse than dying. Or maybe in the moment, survival instinct would override everything else. He shakes his head. I hope I never have to find out. The afternoon light is already fading, the brief day surrendering to the long night. Outside, the thermometer shows minus 66 degrees Celsius and dropping. Nikolai checks the stove, adds wood, 2 logs this time, larch, and adjusts the air intake slightly. Tomorrow we talk about the modern world, he says. How contemporary Yakut people navigate this. What we burn now, what we keep as backup, how we've adapted our hierarchy to include plastics, petroleum products, manufactured materials. But tonight, we've covered the historical basis, the foundation, the knowledge that every survival decision builds on. You nod, watching the flames dance behind the stove's glass door, mesmerized by the ancient chemistry of combustion, carbon and oxygen becoming heat and light and life. And somewhere in your mind, you're building your own hierarchy, running through your own possessions, wondering what you would burn first, what you would burn last, what you would refuse to burn even unto death. It's not comfortable knowledge, but it's human knowledge, earned through millennia of desperate winters and barely successful survival. And it's knowledge that, God's willing, you'll never need to use. Morning comes with a difference you can hear before you can see, the distant rumble of diesel engines, the mechanical growl of modern Yakutia waking up. Trucks being started, generators firing up, snowmobiles coughing to life in the pre-dawn darkness. It's a sound that would have been utterly alien to this landscape a century ago, but now it's the acoustic signature of survival technology layered atop ancient knowledge. Nikolai is already dressed, preparing to head outside. "Come," he says, gesturing toward your borrowed winter gear. "I want to show you something before full light." You layer up, the ritual now familiar, each garment serving its purpose in the thermal defense system, and follow him out into the shocking cold. It's minus 68 degrees Celsius according to the digital thermometer mounted by the door, a device that runs on batteries and represents a technology that would have seemed like magic to Nikolai's great-grandparents. The cold hits with the same physical force as always, stealing breath, freezing moisture, demanding respect. Nikolai leads you to a metal shed behind his house, a corrugated steel structure that looks profoundly out of place next to the traditional wooden buildings. He unlocks a heavy padlock, metal so cold it would freeze to unprotected skin, and pulls open the door. Inside is a museum of modern fuel storage. Plastic jerry cans filled with gasoline and diesel, their contents turned sluggish and syrupy by the cold. Propane tanks, both small camping style and large industrial cylinders. Cans of kerosene, bottles of alcohol, isopropyl and ethanol. Stacks of firelighters, chemical fire starters, waterproof matches. Even a few exotic items. Magnesium fire-starting blocks, gel fuels, compressed sawdust logs manufactured in distant factories. "This is the hybrid approach," Nikolai says, his voice muffled by his fur-lined hood. "We maintain traditional knowledge with harvesting, dung collection, understanding of emergency burning, but we supplement with modern fuels because they're reliable, energy-dense, and relatively easy to store." He picks up a jerry can of diesel, the plastic stiff and brittle from the cold. 20 liters of diesel. At minus 68 degrees Celsius, this is barely liquid, almost gel. But if I warm it, if I bring it inside near the stove, it becomes usable. Diesel contains about 36 megajoules per liter, so this can. 720 megajoules total. In a proper diesel heater, which I have as backup, this could heat my house for 3, maybe 4 days. The mathematics are compelling. That single 20-liter can contain more energy than roughly 40 kilograms of good firewood, and it takes up far less space, doesn't rot, doesn't need to be kept dry, beyond basic storage, and can be burned in efficient modern heaters that extract more usable heat than traditional wood stoves. So why not just use diesel exclusively? 3 reasons, Nikolai says, counting on his thick gloves. 1, cost. Diesel must be purchased, transported here at great expense. Wood I can harvest myself for free, just labor. 2, dependence. If supply chain breaks, if no trucks can reach village for months, diesel runs out. Wood I can always find more of, even in winter. 3, temperature limits. Below about minus 50 degrees Celsius, standard diesel becomes unusable without special additives. Below minus 60 degrees Celsius, even treated diesel struggles. But wood burns at any temperature, always. It's the same redundancy principle you've seen throughout this journey. Never rely on a single solution, always maintain backup systems. Assume the modern convenience will eventually fail. The propane interests you. Nikolai has perhaps a dozen tanks of various sizes. Propane is good, he explains. Energy dense, about 46 megajoules per kilogram. Burns clean, easy to control. But, and this is important, propane stops vaporizing below about minus 42 degrees Celsius. The liquid propane sits in the tank but won't vaporize into gas, so it can't burn. Useless. But you keep it anyway? For spring, autumn, and milder winter days, yes. Also, the house itself keeps some warmth, so I can bring a tank inside, let it warm to maybe minus 30 degrees Celsius, then use it. Not ideal, but possible. And in true emergency, I can still burn the plastic tank after the propane is used. He grins slightly. Waste nothing, remember? This gets at something crucial about modern fuel hierarchy. The materials themselves are often composites, each component potentially useful. A plastic jerry can contain both fuel and container, and the container is polyethylene, derived from petroleum, with an energy content around 43 megajoules per kilogram. A 20-liter can might weigh 800 grams empty. That's an additional 34 megajoules if you burn the plastic after the fuel is exhausted. Of course, burning plastic produces toxic smoke. Polyethylene combustion releases carbon monoxide, various hydrocarbons, potentially dioxins if burned incompletely. You wouldn't burn plastic as a first choice, or even a 10th choice, but in the hierarchy of desperation, toxic smoke that keeps you alive beats clean air in which you freeze. Kerosene is probably the best modern fuel for our climate. Nikolai continues, gesturing to several containers. Burns down to about minus 50 degrees Celsius without modification, very stable, about 37 megajoules per liter. My grandmother switched from fish oil lamps to kerosene in the 1950s and never looked back. Easier to use, less smell, more reliable. He has both old-style wick lamps and modern pressurized kerosene heaters. The lamps are backup technology, simple, no moving parts, essentially impossible to break. The heaters are more efficient, producing more heat per liter of fuel, but they have pumps, mantles, delicate components that can fail. I maintain both. Modern heater for normal use, traditional lamps for when modern heater breaks. Which it will eventually. Everything breaks. The alcohol bottles are interesting, medical-grade ethanol and isopropyl alcohol, purchased in bulk. Alcohol burns very hot, very clean. Ethanol is about 27 megajoules per liter, isopropyl slightly less. Not as efficient as diesel or kerosene for heating, but excellent for emergency fire starting, for warming small spaces quickly, for medical disinfection. Multi-purpose. You're starting to see the pattern. Modern Yakut survival strategy involves creating depth in every category. Multiple fuel types, multiple ignition methods, multiple heating technologies. If the primary system fails, you have secondary. If secondary fails, tertiary. And underlying everything, the traditional knowledge, wood, dung, bone, fat, furniture, waiting as the ultimate backup. Nikolai shows you his fire-starting kit, a waterproof box containing an almost comical variety of methods. Waterproof matches, multiple lighters, standard and windproof, ferrocerium rods, magnesium blocks, chemical tinder, cotton balls soaked in petroleum jelly, commercially manufactured fire starters. In summer, any of these works easily. In winter, at minus 70 degrees Celsius, starting fire is genuinely difficult. Matches don't strike. Lighters don't spark. Even ferrocerium rods become temperamental. So you bring multiple options inside. Keep them warm? Exactly. I keep a smaller kit in the house, always warm, always ready. This shed kit is backup, but I rotate items through the house to ensure everything stays functional. It's another layer of the hierarchy, not just what you burn, but how you ignite it. The best fuel in the world is useless if you can't get combustion started. And at minus 70 degrees Celsius, ignition is its own challenge. Back inside, thawing out again, Nikolai makes a sketch on paper showing his complete fuel inventory and burn priority. Tier 1, use freely harvested firewood, collected dung, purchase diesel/kerosene for heaters. Tier 2, use when Tier 1 depleted propane, gasoline, manufactured fire logs, alcohol fuels. Tier 3, emergency use with scraps, damaged tools, broken furniture, worn clothing. Tier 4, desperate measures functional furniture, good clothing, structural elements, non-critical walls, interior partitions. Tier 5, survival at any cost doors, window frames, critical structural beams, sacred/sentimental. Items. Tier 6, beyond desperation materials from deceased, if applicable, plastic containers, toxic materials that produce dangerous smoke. The modern additions, petroleum fuels, manufactured items, mostly slot into tiers 1 and 2, he explains. They're preferred because they're efficient and don't compromise other survival needs. But notice they don't eliminate the lower tiers. Those are still there, still memorized, still ready if needed. He then shows you something unexpected. A spreadsheet on a laptop computer, powered by a car battery connected to solar panels on the roof. The spreadsheet meticulously tracks his fuel inventory, kilograms of wood by type, liters of diesel, propane tank levels, even estimated burn hours remaining at various usage rates. "My son made this for me," Nikolai says with evident pride. He's engineer, lives in Yakutsk, understands computers. He said modern management tools can help with traditional survival. So we track everything, calculate reserves, predict when we need to harvest more wood or purchase more diesel. It's a perfect synthesis. Ancient knowledge implemented through modern technology. The fundamental understanding hasn't changed. You need to know what you have and how long it will last. But the tools for tracking and calculating have evolved. Does this make survival easier? Easier? Maybe slightly. Safer? Absolutely. With the spreadsheet, I can see 2 months ahead, 3 months, plan for contingencies. Before, it was more intuitive, more guesswork. You looked at the woodpile and thought, is this enough? Now I calculate, based on average winter temperatures and my burn rate. I have fuel until March 15th, plus 20% reserve. But he's quick to add, the spreadsheet is tool, not solution. Tells me when I'm running low, but it doesn't create more fuel. The actual work, harvesting, hauling, stacking, burning, this hasn't changed. Still requires labor, planning, physical strength. Modern Yakutia, you're realizing, isn't a place where technology has eliminated the fundamental challenges of extreme cold. Rather, it's a place where technology and tradition coexist in layers, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. The diesel heater is wonderful until diesel gels or supply chains fail, at which point the wood stove takes over. The electric lights are convenient until the power fails, at which point the kerosene lamps emerge. The digital thermometer is accurate until the batteries die, at which point you judge temperature by how fast spit freezes when you step outside. Young people sometimes forget this, Nikolai says with a touch of concern. They grow up with reliable electricity, with stores that sell diesel year-round, with snowmobiles instead of dog sleds. They think, we're modern now, we don't need the old ways. Then there's a bad winter, something breaks, and they realize they don't know how to harvest wood properly, don't know how to render fat, don't know the hierarchy. So you teach them? When they'll listen, yes. I take my grandchildren into the forest, show them which trees to cut, how to stack wood for drying. I show them the fuel shed, explain why we keep redundancy. I tell them stories, he gestures broadly, encompassing everything you've discussed over these days. Stories like the ones I've told you, so they understand why knowledge matters. It's cultural transmission in real time, the same process that's preserved Yakut survival knowledge for millennia, now competing with modern distractions, internet, television, the seductive certainty of industrial society. Outside, full daylight has arrived, the sun reaching its meager apex. Nikolai checks the thermometer. Minus 64 degrees Celsius, relatively balmy. Good day for outdoor work, he announces, and you can't tell if he's joking. He shows you his backup heating systems. A modern diesel heater, currently off, the wood stove being sufficient, a propane space heater, stored but ready, even an old metal barrel converted into an emergency stove that can burn almost anything, wood, coal, trash, whatever's available. This barrel stove, very inefficient, lots of heat loss, smoke everywhere. But it works when nothing else does. My grandfather built it in 1955, used it for 40 years. I keep it in the shed, oiled, ready. The barrel stove is crude technology, literally a steel drum with a door cut into one end and a stovepipe welded to the top, but it represents the ultimate backup. A heating system so simple it cannot fail, that requires no special fuel, that can burn fuel too wet or irregular for a proper stove. If I'm down to burning my furniture and my door frames, Nikolai says, this is what I use. Feed it anything burnable, it produces heat. Not efficient heat, not comfortable heat, but heat. The hierarchy has expanded in your mind. It's not just what you burn, but what you burn it in. Modern efficient heaters for premium fuels. Traditional wood stoves for standard operation. Crude emergency stoves for desperate times. Every layer is redundancy. Every redundancy is insurance against the cold's infinite patience. Nikolai makes lunch, more reindeer, this time with rice and vegetables, and you eat while discussing the economic aspects. Diesel costs money. Propane costs money. Even matches and lighters cost money. In a cash-poor region like rural Yakutia, these expenses matter, creating pressure to rely more heavily on free resources like harvested wood. Some families here, they can't afford much diesel. Maybe they buy one tank for the whole winter, use it only for emergencies or for the coldest weeks. Rest of the time, wood. This means they need more wood, which means more labor, more time harvesting. It's a trade. Money versus time and effort. The wealthier families maintain larger diesel reserves, can afford backup generators, can purchase manufactured fire logs and premium kerosene. The poorer families rely more on traditional methods, burning more wood and dung, being more conservative with fuel use, living closer to the edge of adequacy. But here's the thing, Nikolai says. When the truly bad winters come, when supply chains fail and diesel can't be delivered to anyone, rich and poor become equal. Everyone falls back on wood, dung, and knowledge. The family that stayed practiced with traditional methods sometimes does better than the family that bought comfort with money. It's a reminder that wealth provides buffer but not immunity. The cold doesn't care about your bank account. You spend the afternoon helping Nikolai organize his wood shed, stacking different types by size and species, ensuring airflow for continued drying, making the inventory visible and manageable. It's satisfying physical work, and it gives you visceral appreciation for the sheer mass of material required, cord after cord of wood, each log representing calories and heat and time. As darkness returns, early, always early in winter, you sit by the stove one more time, watching the flames consume carefully selected larch, turning solid matter into ephemeral warmth. Tomorrow, Nikolai says, we do something different. We inventory your life, your modern, comfortable, warm life far from here. We figure out what you would burn, in what order, if winter came to wherever you live. It's a thought exercise that suddenly feels very relevant, very personal, and slightly terrifying. The final morning arrives quietly, the darkness outside still absolute, the stove still burning, Nikolai already awake and tending the eternal flame. You've spent 3 days immersed in the mathematics and philosophy of fuel hierarchy, learning how the Yakut people have survived for centuries in conditions that should preclude human habitation. Now comes the uncomfortable exercise. Applying this knowledge to your own life, your own home, your own possessions. Nikolai has prepared tea and sits across from you with a notepad. Actual paper, not his son's laptop. Tell me about your home, he says. Not where it is exactly, but what it's like. How you heat it, what it contains, how prepared you are for the cold. You describe your reality. A modern dwelling, probably in a temperate climate, heated by central heating, maybe natural gas, maybe electric, maybe oil-fired. Insulated walls, double-pane windows, thermostats that maintain constant comfort. You've likely never thought about the thermal budget of your home, never calculated how many kilowatt hours it takes to maintain 20 degrees Celsius inside when it's freezing outside, because the heat just arrives, automatically, invisibly. And if it stopped? Nikolai asks, if your heating system failed in winter, what would you do? The honest answer for most people is call a repair service or go to a hotel or rely on emergency services. The idea of personally managing heat generation, of burning materials to stay warm, is so foreign to modern temperate climate life that most people don't even have a mental framework for it. But let's imagine, Nikolai continues, that these options aren't available. Big storm, power is out everywhere. No repair services can reach you, roads are blocked. Now it's just you, your home, and whatever you can burn. What's your hierarchy? You start mentally inventorying. If you have a fireplace or wood stove, and many modern homes don't, do you have firewood? Most people keep maybe a decorative stack, enough for a cozy evening, not enough for sustained heating. A proper winter's supply for a temperate climate might be 2 to 3 cords of wood. Most modern homes have perhaps a tenth of that. So your designated fuel runs out quickly, Nikolai notes. Maybe 1 day, 2 at most. Then what? Furniture becomes obvious. Modern homes are filled with wood furniture, tables, chairs, bed frames, shelving, cabinets. But there's a crucial difference from Yakutian furniture. Modern furniture is often composite, made from particle board, MDF, plywood, materials that are with derivatives glued and compressed together. These burn differently than solid wood. Particle board, for instance, contains roughly 16 megajoules per kilogram, decent energy content, but it's held together with formaldehyde-based resins that release toxic fumes when burned. MDF is similar. Even solid wood furniture is often treated with varnishes, stains, and fire retardants that produce dangerous smoke. So you're burning, yes, Nikolai says, but you're also poisoning yourself. Without proper ventilation, without understanding what chemicals are in your materials, you might trade freezing for carbon monoxide poisoning or toxic inhalation. It's a dimension barely present in traditional Yakutian survival. Their materials were almost entirely natural, untreated wood and hide and bone. Modern materials are engineered, chemical-laden, optimized for everything except emergency combustion. What about your fuel sources? Nikolai asks. Natural gas, electricity, these come from outside, yes? You don't generate them yourself. So when they stop, you have no reserve, no backup tank, no stored fuel. This is perhaps the starkest difference between modern and traditional survival preparation. The Yakut maintain physical reserves, cords of wood, tanks of diesel, supplies they control directly. Modern temperate climate dwellers rely on just-in-time delivery of energy through infrastructure, gas pipelines, electrical grids, fuel trucks. When infrastructure fails, there's no reserve. Some people have camping fuel, you offer. Small propane canisters for portable stoves. Nikolai nods. How many? How much fuel total? Most people might have 2 to 3 small camping canisters, perhaps 500 grams of propane each. At 46 megajoules per kilogram, that's roughly 69 megajoules total, enough to heat a small room for maybe 10 to 15 hours in moderate cold. Not even a full day. So within 2 days, probably less, you've exhausted everything designed to burn. Now you're looking at your possessions, deciding what goes into the fire. The exercise becomes uncomfortably personal. Your bookshelves, paper is excellent kindling, and hardcover books contain glue and board that burn reasonably well. But which books do you burn first? The ones you haven't read? The ones you have read and no longer need? The childhood favorites, the signed copies, the inherited volumes from your grandparents? Same hierarchy as my grandmother's sewing box, Nikolai observes. Sentimental value versus thermal value. You'd burn the books you care least about first, preserving the meaningful ones until desperation overrides sentiment. Your wooden kitchen items, cutting boards, utensils, wooden bowls, probably 2 to 3 kilograms total, enough for perhaps 4 to 6 hours of heat. Burn them and you lose food preparation tools, but you stay warm. Your clothing, if you have redundant layers. Modern synthetic fibers, polyester, nylon, acrylic, are petroleum derivatives with high energy content, 30 to 40 megajoules per kilogram, but they burn dirty and melt dangerously. Natural fibers, cotton, wool, linen, burn cleaner but with less total energy. How much clothing do you own? Nikolai asks. Honestly, most people in developed countries own far more clothing than necessary, closets full of items worn rarely or never. In a fuel hierarchy, these become expendable. That jacket you haven't worn in 3 years? Burns for maybe an hour. Those old cotton t-shirts? Excellent fire starters. But the psychological barrier is real. Burning your possessions feels like failure, like loss of control, like descent into barbarism. It requires accepting that the normal rules have suspended, that comfort and ownership are now secondary to immediate survival. Your home also contains plastics, Nikolai continues. Storage containers, furniture components, packaging, electronics housings. All petroleum-based, all burnable. Polyethylene, polypropylene, PVC, ABS. Modern homes are filled with plastics, representing enormous potential energy. A plastic laundry basket might weigh 2 kilograms and contain 86 megajoules of energy, but burning it releases hydrogen chloride, dioxins, benzene, and other compounds that can kill you as surely as cold can. So you have choices: freeze cleanly or survive dirty. Which do you choose? In actual emergency situations, people almost always choose survival, accepting toxic smoke as preferable to hypothermia. But it's a trade-off that traditional Yakut people rarely faced. Their materials were cleaner, if less abundant. Nikolai then asks about your house structure itself. Modern homes, are they wood-framed? Many are, at least partially, with studs, floor joists, roof rafters, trim, doors, window frames. There's often substantial wood in the structure, though much of it is hidden behind drywall and insulation. So theoretically, Nikolai says, you could start dismantling. Remove interior doors first, burn those, then trim, then non-load-bearing walls. But do you know which walls are load-bearing? Do you know how to remove them without collapsing your house? Almost certainly not. Most modern people have no understanding of their home's structural engineering. Burning the wrong wall could cause catastrophic failure, burying you under rubble or exposing you directly to outside temperatures. This is what happens when knowledge is lost, Nikolai says quietly. My grandfather could look at his Balagan and know exactly which poles could be removed in which order. You look at your home and see, what? Walls, doors. You don't know what's critical and what's not. It's a humbling realization. Modern homes are in some ways more materially abundant than traditional Yakutian dwellings. More furniture, more possessions, more combustible material overall, but the knowledge of how to use it all as emergency fuel is largely absent. Nikolai sketches out what your hierarchy might look like. Day 1. Any firewood you have, camping fuel, decorative items, cardboard boxes. Day 2 to 3. Furniture you care least about, extra clothing, books, wooden kitchen items. Day 4 to 5. Furniture you need but can sacrifice, doors, window frames, trim. Day 6 to 7. Plastics, accepting toxic smoke, structural components, cherished items. Day 8 plus. You're either rescued, you've fled to another location, or you've run out of options. In temperate climate, Nikolai notes, you probably don't need to survive as long as we do here. Your winters are shorter, less severe. If you can make it 1 week, maybe 2, rescue will likely arrive or conditions will improve. But even a week is challenging if you're unprepared. And if the emergency is more severe, major infrastructure collapse, extreme weather event, societal disruption, the timeline extends, and your material abundance matters less than your knowledge and preparation. So what should I do differently? You ask. Nikolai considers. First, understand your home's thermal properties. How long does it stay warm after heating stops? Can you close off rooms to heat a smaller space? Do you have adequate insulation and weather stripping? Second, maintain fuel reserves. Even if you have modern heating, keep wood or alternative fuel available. Camping stoves, propane heaters, anything that provides backup heat independent of infrastructure. Third, acquire knowledge. Learn what burns safely and what doesn't. Understand your home's structure. Know how to improvise heating without poisoning yourself. Fourth, practice. Don't wait for emergency to discover your fireplace doesn't draw properly or your camping stove is broken. Test your backup systems regularly. This practical advice, scalable to any climate and living situation. The specific hierarchy of what you burn matters less than having thought through the hierarchy in advance, having options prepared, having knowledge ready. Most important, Nikolai adds, understand that stuff is replaceable. Furniture can be rebuilt, books can be bought again, clothing can be replaced. You cannot. Your family cannot. When the choice is between freezing and burning your possessions, always burn the possessions. He pauses, then adds, but also, don't wait until you're making that choice. Prepare before winter. Maintain reserves. Keep knowledge alive. This is what separates survival from disaster. You both sit quietly for a moment, the stove crackling, the tea cooling, the darkness outside absolute except for the faint glow of a neighbor's window. Another fire burning. Another family maintaining the eternal vigilance against cold. I'm privileged, you finally say. I live somewhere warm, where heating is reliable, where I've never had to seriously think about burning my possessions for warmth. Yes, Nikolai agrees. You are privileged, but privilege is temporary. Climate changes, infrastructure fails, emergencies happen. The people who survive are the ones who understood this before the crisis arrived. He stands and walks to the window, looking out at the frozen landscape that has been his family's home for generations. In Yakutia, we know the cold always wins eventually. Always. But we can delay that victory, can stretch our survival, can pass our knowledge to the next generation so they can continue the fight. This is all we've ever done. All we can do. The hierarchy of fuels, what we burn first, what we burn last, what we refuse to burn, this is our strategy. It's not perfect. It doesn't guarantee survival. But it gives us a chance, a framework for making terrible choices in the least terrible way. He turns back to you. Now you have this framework too. You've thought through your hierarchy. You understand the mathematics, the psychology, the desperation. You know what you would burn if the fire went out. I hope, he continues, that you never need to use this knowledge. I hope your heating stays reliable, your infrastructure stays functional, your winters stay mild. But if someday, somehow, you find yourself cold with failing heat, you'll remember this week. You'll remember the hierarchy. You'll remember that survival requires hard choices and that choosing to live, choosing to burn what must be burned, is not shameful. It's human. The wind picks up outside, rattling the windows, reminding you both that the cold is always there, always patient, always ready to exploit any weakness. But inside, the fire burns, the stove radiates heat, and two humans sit warm in defiance of the impossible temperature beyond the walls. Nikolai adds one more log, larch, always larch for the long burn, and closes the stove door with the practiced motion of 10,000 repetitions. Thank you, you say inadequately. No, he replies. Thank you for listening, for carrying this knowledge forward, for understanding that what we do here, what my ancestors did, what all cold climate people have always done, this matters. This is human achievement, as important as any technology or art or science. We survive where we shouldn't. We endure where endurance seems impossible. And we remember, we pass the knowledge down. We keep the fire burning. Outside, the temperature has dropped to minus 72 degrees Celsius, approaching the record extremes. Inside, you're warm, safe, surrounded by enough fuel to last through the night, through tomorrow, through the weeks ahead. But you understand now, in a way you didn't before, how contingent this warmth is, how many decisions and preparations and pieces of knowledge stand between comfort and catastrophe. And you understand your own hierarchy now, the mental inventory of what you would burn, in what order if the unthinkable happened and you had to choose. You hope never to use it, but you're grateful to know it. The journey through Yakutia's hierarchy of fuel has taken you through physics and history, through psychology and survival arithmetic, through the comfortable and the unthinkable. You've learned that survival in extreme cold isn't about one big decision but thousands of small ones, each informed by knowledge passed down through generations, each representing a trade-off between present need and future consequence. You've learned that what we burn reveals what we value, and that the order in which we're willing to sacrifice our possessions reveals our deepest priorities. You've learned that the cold is patient, that winter is long, and that preparation is everything. And perhaps most importantly, you've learned that humans are remarkably, stubbornly resilient, capable of surviving in environments that should kill us, finding warmth where none should exist, making impossible mathematics work through knowledge, community, and sheer determination. The fire continues to burn. And now, as our journey winds down, let me bring you back from the frozen expanses of Yakutia to wherever you are right now. Comfortable, warm, safe. Feel the softness of your pillow, the weight of your blanket, the perfect temperature of your room. You're not fighting for survival, not calculating fuel reserves, not making impossible choices. You're simply here, relaxed, your breathing slowing, your thoughts drifting like smoke on the wind. The stove in Nikolai's house continues burning through the Yakutian night, its steady warmth a testament to human persistence. But you're not there anymore. You're here, in your own space, carrying the knowledge forward but not needing to use it, understanding the hierarchy but grateful not to choose. Let the images fade, the frozen trees, the crackling fire, the endless white landscape. Let them blur into gentle darkness, into the peaceful space between waking and sleeping, where stories become dreams and knowledge settles into memory. Your breathing is slow now, deep and even. The tension in your shoulders has released. The calculations have stopped. There's nothing to burn, nothing to measure, nothing to decide. Just warmth, just safety, just the gentle drift toward sleep. The fire burns on, somewhere far away, tended by people who understand its language. But you're released from that vigil now, free to rest, to sleep, to let consciousness fade into the comfortable dark. Sweet dreams, friend. May your fires never go out, and may you never need to choose what burns first. Sleep well,